Thank you everyone for joining into the picture together. This picture will be remembered for a whole long time in human history. Now we are having two major keynote speeches by Mr. Norman Anderson and Mr. Jeffrey Burns. So first of all, I would like to invite Mr. Norman Anderson, Chairman of CEO of CGLA Strategic Infrastructure Performance Institute, who is a globally renowned infrastructure strategist and integrator. He's a frequent writer to Forbes and Bloomberg, is a specialist on infrastructure investment. He has provided and provides important guidance to the administrations of Presidents Clinton, Obama, and Joe Biden, as well as global communities to drive investment in infrastructures to truly and meaningfully contribute to the enhancement of values of life for everyone at every corner of the world and build a better future for all. Please join me to give him a big welcoming speech, welcoming hands. Sorry.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to talk a little bit about my book and why I wrote the book and what it has to do with Korea and U.S.-Korean partnership, especially in terms of strategic infrastructure. So the first thing I want to talk about is how you put flames on a computer presentation. This is the book, Our Strategic Infrastructure Roadmap Forward. And the idea is really to think about infrastructure in a different way. It was written thinking about my country, but as it happens, it matters globally. Professor Hwang was kind enough to see the book and decide to translate it into Korean and bring to my attention how relevant the book is for countries around the world. One of the things I'm trying to do, and Professor Hwang mentioned it earlier, is get people to think about infrastructure takes a long time, and you have to project into the future. So I start the book by looking at infrastructure from Thanksgiving 2030 and what we want to have happen now so that we have, in our famous holiday, a fantastic one. But the other big issue is this is a moment of gigantic shift. And it's to digitization and electrification. Obviously, Korea is one of the leaders in that area. The U.S. is trying to figure out, given our infrastructure, how much we have, how we can digitize and how we can electrify. And I think the partnership between Korea and the U.S. is going to be really important there. I also want to talk a little bit about leadership, because leadership is unbelievably important in this process. And, this big issue of how is infrastructure such a critical issue all of a sudden in this moment, as my friend Jang Song said, in human history. So I'm going to run through the book very quickly so you all have a sense of what we're trying to do here. It really, one of the powerful pieces of infrastructure, and I really thought of Korea when I used this quote, "Moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." I think of Korea in that sense. I've only been here for a couple of days, but it's extraordinary what Korea has done in the last 20 years, in the last 40 years, in the last 60 years. Infrastructure is really how you draw on history, what you want to be. And it happens that all of a sudden infrastructure is a first order issue. It's no longer a secondary issue, a tertiary issue. Infrastructure really matters for our future. That's how we see the future. That's how we create the future. One of the things I think about, and I was thinking about earlier, is this beautiful university the level of respect that Koreans have for their university system is extraordinary. And this university, just like real infrastructure, just like bridges and tunnels, just like airports, it really tells you who you are and who you can be. It's a powerful, powerful symbol. And no more powerful symbol have I seen in my life than this new SNU campus, how it was built and what your plans are for the future. For me, it's extraordinary. And then I talk a little bit about how infrastructure can bring us all together, because it gives us a purpose, and it gives us a purpose not for next year or the following year. It gives us a purpose for 10 years, for 20 years, for 30 years, because the decisions you make now matter for the next 10, 20, or 30 years. This is something that it's very clear that politicians around the world don't really understand that yet, and that's incredibly important. And I love this word resolve, right? And I think of that in terms of what you all have done over the last 40, 60 years. Decide to do something and do it and become world leaders. That's what I'm trying to convince my country to think about, and how I want my country to think going forward. So why infrastructure, why now, and why is it such a tough question? This graph I like. I put it together. I love this graph because I was trying to think about what the world has looked like over the last 40 years. And you can see at the bottom I have the size of GDP, but if you think about over the last 40 years, Korea's GDP has grown 25 times. That has to give you all a tremendous amount of confidence. Obviously China 75 times, but Japan only 4.6 times, the US only 7.5 times, the UK 5 times. Korea really, if you think about that, what you're doing is investing in the future, and you're investing very successfully in the future. These are big decisions. They involve big risks. They involve resolve, but they also involve tremendous accomplishment. So for all the Americans here, let's give our Korean friends a big round of applause. For me, it's incredibly inspiring. So, one of the things we're looking at is how do you think about, and this is where blockchains comes in, and my friend Jeff Burns, how do you think about infrastructure in 2030 and individual sovereignty, which is the critical issue? How do you think about the trust issue between the public and private sector? I love this idea. I don't know if you all are familiar with the marshmallow experiment, but it's a fantastic experiment. Thank you. Where it was about 40 years ago, psychologists came up with the idea of trying to see how 3- and 4-year-olds would react if you sat them in a room by themselves and you put one marshmallow in front of them. And you said, if you can wait for 5 minutes, I'll give you another marshmallow. If you can't, just eat that marshmallow, that's fine, there won't be any punishment. And it turned out that the children who could wait for 5 minutes were tremendously more successful throughout their lives than the other children. And that's one of the things that I see in infrastructure, that countries that invest in infrastructure, because you don't get your marshmallows right away. You get your marshmallows in 10, 20, 30 years, and you get marshmallows for the whole country. Those are the people who are successful. And Korea invests probably 3.5 times more each year than Latin American countries do in infrastructure, and you invest better as well. So unbelievably important from my point of view. By the way, you all know that I'm an American, so if you have any questions, just interrupt me. I love to answer questions, unless they're hard questions. So another point I wanted to focus on is this idea of strategic projects. Strategic projects. That's what we call the event strategic infrastructure, because projects are what you build on. You build one project and it builds confidence. It builds the research capability. It builds the team of people who can work on the next project. And as I mentioned earlier, trust. what we've seen is that countries that are successful in building infrastructure, it's because the public sector, the financial sector, and the engineering community and the university community all trust each other. They're friends, they work closely together, but they trust each other because of the success they've had, not because they like the idea of trust. It's because they've been successful together. That, to me, is hugely important. I love my flames, by the way. These are the top 500 projects in the U.S. We're going to work on this tomorrow with Professor Huang. But if you click on any of these dots, you see the project and you see the opportunity and you see what's missing. Tremendous to focus, instead of talking in general terms about infrastructure, talk in specific terms, and then bringing, I was just on the phone earlier with West Virginia, and they would love to talk to you about a smart city project in West Virginia. So what you do is you get a specific project, and then you build that out increasingly digitally, increasingly in terms of electrification. Why strategic projects? I've run through that. And strategic projects in the fourth industrial revolution are absolutely critical. One of the things I'm trying to convince the Biden administration to do is to think not so much in terms of build back better. That sounds like the 1950s and you have a convertible and you're driving down, and if Joe Biden still had hair, his hair would go back in the wind. What we're really talking about is how do you build this digital infrastructure for the future, because infrastructure is actually going to be the brains of the economy. You guys know this. It becomes the brains of the economy within the next 10 years. Given all of the sensors, given AI, given autonomous vehicles, given the complete digitization of infrastructure, the people who are making decisions are the people who write the algorithms. We're simply going to be responding to those decisions. This is a tremendous transformation. So chapter 4, really looking at how you think about strategic institutions. And one of the things I've been most impressed with, this is, I love to play with this program. This is originally a Pixar program. So it is with your aid as the people that I think we shall be able to preserve not the country, for the country will preserve itself, but the institutions of the country. Those institutions which have made us free, intelligent, and happy, the most free, the most intelligent, and the happiest people on the globe. Those are Abraham Lincoln's words during our Civil War. And one of the things I think about a lot are institutions. Who's in charge? And you know, my conversations again here at SNU with Professor Huang have been phenomenally productive, because we're really talking about infrastructure for citizens. We're talking about smart cities for citizens. That's very different from how our competitors think about this. And so I have 3 suggestions for the White House. We need a National Strategic Infrastructure Council, because you've got to have somebody to talk to. We need a national infrastructure bank, and we need vital state infrastructure banks to bring funds into projects and to bring a whole new level of expertise into projects. But what's really impressed me in Korea is the fact that you have institutions like the Technology and ICT Ministry, or like the Land and Infrastructure and Transport Ministry, that actually are much more focused on modern infrastructure than, for instance, in the U.S., not to criticize my country, you know, because you're not allowed to do that when you leave the country. But Smart Cities is located about 20 levels down within our Department of Transportation. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all. And it really doesn't make any sense for the people in the Department of Transportation. They would love to be able to do more work, make better decisions faster. So that you guys can see what I was doing with the book is just walking through a new paradigm, a complete different paradigm change. Just trying to make sure I'm still on time. Chapter 5, this is the heart and soul of everything that we're doing. Technology, the creative explosion. It's incredible as you all know, but most people don't know the dramatic explosion of technology. A friend of mine is the CEO of AES Corporation, and he simply told me 2 years ago, he has a battery company now, he has 3 or 4 new digital companies, he's getting rid of all his coal plants, builds power plants all over the world, just bought a new solar company. He said, look, Norm, stuff that I thought was going to take 5 years, we're already implementing in a year and a half, and it's really late for that. I mean, so the pace of technology, the velocity is incredible. But here's the problem, that the infrastructure brand globally is a horrible brand. These are surveys that my company did. Only 18% of people, let's look at it the other way, globally 82% of people in the infrastructure industry think it's a weak or average brand. Could you imagine that if you were Nike or if you were Adidas and people in your industry thought you were a horrible brand? You'd fix it. The infrastructure guys never do anything. In the US, it's way worse. It's 91%. It's very hard to build infrastructure if people actually think it's that weak a brand. So that's one of the areas, you know, Michael, I'm looking at you, that's one of the areas where it has to jump out at you. That needs to be fixed, because otherwise there's just too much resistance to what you want to get done. So the threat and the opportunity of technology, you have to really help people understand that what's coming, you know, this conversation dominates that it's going to take away jobs. The fact is that, you know, people in, you know, when the Model T started, they were very worried that people who fed horses were going to lose their jobs. All of a sudden, it created enormous new industries. So, you know, that's one of the things we have to focus on. I just think that digitization and electrification of everything is going to transform everything. So impressed by the autonomy track and the work that Smart Radar is doing. Unbelievable, and such a privilege to be able to visit with you all as well. And then the idea of intelligent design, because unless we, all of us together, figure out what we want the future to look like, it's going to look like what somebody else makes it look like. And so all of us have to figure out how to figure that out. You've got to shape this explosion in technology. And it's interesting, who figured out what these words are first? It's interesting because, you know, all the technology comes together around smart cities. And especially if you look at smart cities the way Singapore is looking at smart cities, from the citizens' view, Singapore, I keep saying, I apologize. The way Korea is looking at smart cities. Singapore is just a city, Korea is a country. So, you know, there's a jet lag problem. But it's really interesting because it's where all the technologies come together. It's where all the new paradigms come together. And it's where the solutions are for human beings and how they live going forward. The ownership piece of this is of particular interest of mine, because you know the issue in the U.S., if you think about it, is we have $30 trillion in debt. And so, you know, part of the country thinks that the only way to pay for infrastructure is to raise taxes, but that creates real problems for the rest of the country. And in fact, we're a pension fund superpower. We have about $32 trillion in pension fund assets that simply should go into infrastructure projects. If you do 10% total, that would give us $3 trillion to invest in infrastructure. 88% of infrastructure professionals, including pension fund executives, believe that we ought to put pension fund money into specific infrastructure projects. So that would be a real transformation in terms of how we think about this. And one of the issues, I'm not going to go through every issue, but one of the really interesting pieces of this conversation is that there's a huge amount of energy that's on the sidelines right now because we're worried that private investment in infrastructure is going to make rich people richer. In fact, any investment in infrastructure is a public goods investment. It's never a private goods investment. It's always a public goods investment. So the opportunity is to bring everybody in to this kind of a of a new investment model, a new ownership model, something that would be extraordinary. And blockchain actually, and blockchains, has a real opportunity here because you're really talking about fractional ownership of your infrastructure assets. That's the way we used to own our infrastructure assets. One of the interesting facts, I suppose, about my history is that my grandfather left the United States Navy in 1898 as an electrician. He went to Wisconsin, gathered all the Norwegian farmers together. They formed a co-op so he could dam up a river and start something called the Oslo Power and Light Company. That's how we've always built our infrastructure. If you had an undergirding of blockchain technology, people who were pension fund owners could actually invest in infrastructure projects, receive dividends, see what was happening with those assets. A complete transformation in terms of how we think about where we are. You know, one of the biggest issues that it probably, to tell you guys the truth, didn't occur to me until I was about 3/4 of the way through the book, is we're living, this is a privileged time for us. We're living in a period that's the biggest industrial transformation in 120 years since the advent of the internal combustion engine. So we get to create the world that's coming. And not a lot of people realize that, but I know that that's what you all are about in terms of SNU. And that's a huge opportunity, but it's also a huge responsibility. We're really creating public goods, and public goods give everybody the opportunity to then go ahead and create their private goods. Now, this is what the book is called, Vision. And that's where Professor Huang and I get along very well. You know, and this is a quote from the book, and it's from Jeff Burns, the founder of blockchains. The future, it's a chance, the vision is how we create, and infrastructure is how we create the future in which we want to live, right? That's what we're really doing here. That's what to me is so important. But you've got to create a vision, you've got to recognize and incentivize the visionaries. Too often, you know, people say the vision's too big, as a result, that person is crazy. Imagine if Elon Musk would have failed. Everybody would have agreed that Elon Musk is a crazy guy, electric cars, SpaceX, etc. Well, now everybody thinks Elon Musk is a crazy guy who's a genius because he gets things done. Phenomenal story from my point of view in terms of how we really think about life. Visionaries, China is pushing the U.S. really hard to make better investments and better decisions, but we're not there yet. And at the end of the day, we're really talking about creating real work for real people. Sorry, a lot of flame here, but this is Moses on the mountaintop. This is vision. Vision's something that's really important, but vision is hard to get, and it's very scary in terms of a country, because if you fail, you fail. Another friend of mine says that vision is really listening to what the future whispers, but I don't think that's true. I think vision is making the future. I think the vision has more to do with resolve and courage and trust and working together. So leadership, this is probably my favorite chapter in the book. I talk about heroic leadership, disruptive leadership, and adaptive leadership. I went to the Kennedy School at Harvard. Fantastic professor there, famous guy. He focused on adaptive leadership. I work with people like General Petraeus, Hank Greenberg. They focus on disruptive leadership. Heroic leadership is, I think, what's going to be absolutely critical as well. You know, one of the things that's interesting is to ask you all, who are really leaders? When I ask that question, who's the real leader in terms of your minds? who comes to mind? And you know, you think of maybe a business leader or a military leader or somebody like that, but really the leaders are you guys, right? The leaders are you all, and it's within you. We had a nice dinner last night and we were talking about that, Professor Huang. It's really important that people understand that we have the power individually to make these decisions, and if bad decisions get made, it's our fault, not somebody else's fault. This is my favorite example. This is Billy Mitchell. Billy Mitchell, in 1924, was in favor of developing aircraft carriers for the U.S. Navy and air power for the U.S. military, and no one would listen to him because they thought aircraft dropping bombs, et cetera, wasn't going to go anywhere. And he gave a speech where he said, the government is derelict in its duty, and the government has no business not making these kinds of investments. And he was court-martialed and kicked out of the service. And obviously, about 8 years later, in 1932, we started to build serious aircraft carriers, and that's what actually mattered in terms of winning the Pacific War. Disruptive leadership is really important, because unless you have disruptive leaders, you don't go from where you are right now to where you have to be. These are the people who make things happen. And one of the things that I've seen throughout my career is that disruptive leaders, people with real vision, are absolutely critical for infrastructure. This I'm going to go through quickly because I want to get to the last couple of slides. And, you know, if you really want to understand this chapter, you can buy the book. Just kidding. So anyway, but, you know, one of the big differentiators that we've seen everywhere is this issue of trust, which I was mentioning earlier. And it strikes me, you know, I've been at SNU for the last 3 or 4 days, it strikes me that universities play a critical role in trust, because you guys create knowledge, you create intelligence, and you bring people together around that. So, you know, trust is based on a shared experience in terms of getting things done, but who really injects the kind of intelligence into a system so that you know what to do? It's people like you all. So thank you very much for what you're doing. I think trust is just a superpower in terms of infrastructure project ideation, development, and execution. These are a couple of articles I wrote recently. The one on the right I just published yesterday about Korea, and Professor Huang and Danny Kang gave me some fantastic ideas, so I apologize for stealing from you guys. It's your fault for talking to me. And then this one just talks about the $4.5 trillion global infrastructure market, which I just think there's an unlimited potential for the U.S. and Korea to work, especially in terms of digital infrastructure. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. The other thing that we really have to do is make tremendous companies. You all know that the biggest companies in the world, the biggest one working on infrastructure is actually a Spanish company, $70 billion in annual revenue. The largest U.S. company has less than $20 billion in annual revenue. And then, of course, the Chinese companies. But what we have, and again, Korea and the U.S. together, and I think, Michael, you're a real thought leader in this, is technology. and the idea of empowering citizens with technology to live better lives. I think that's just absolutely critical, especially when you think about infrastructure strategically. This is simply how fast our pension fund assets are growing, and we've got to figure out how to use them not for PE investments, but for long-term, regular return infrastructure investments. The last point is unbelievably important to me. Infrastructure, it's really all about creating, it's really all about giving, and it's the core of aspirations. It's what we want, again, for ourselves, it's what we want for our children, it's what we want for our community and for our country. So infrastructure is all about creating public value. That means my time is up. Luckily, I only have one more slide, I think. So global leadership, again, significant opportunity for U.S.-Korea partnership. I love the idea of revitalizing democracy. actually figuring out what to do and then doing it. I think we can do that together. Enabling citizens, this is my last flame. These are democracies around the world. We're really going in the wrong direction in terms of democracy. It's absolutely critical. We've got to figure out how to strengthen democracies and do it successfully. Well, this is my last flame. Korea and the U.S. need to work strategically together, and this is urgent. This isn't maybe we should do it tomorrow or the next. This is urgent. That's why I'm so happy that I'm here and so happy to be able to work with you all. Now, here are my top 10 recommendations. These, you have to read the book. I'm not going to tell you this stuff. And then I want one more thing. This is Steve Jobs famous. One more thing. Look at this picture here. That's my dad in the middle. And he led the Incheon air cover at Incheon in 1950. But isn't that a tremendous picture? It's like 30 years old, lieutenant colonel. Isn't that amazing? So anyway, I wanted to share that with you, and then I want to share another amazing picture with you as well. This is the team here, the Smart Cities Global team here, led by Professor Huang, and I've just had a tremendous time working with them over the last couple of days, and I just want to congratulate SNU for all that you've done and that all we're going to do together in terms of the U.S.-Korea infrastructure partnership. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.